Good evening. Welcome. Hello. I always like to echo. Welcome to the live streaming Lessons of Vietnam show. Telling the real story of the American War, Vietnam, and the women who served there. I know you can read that on the screen, so I'm not going to go over it, but I want you to be able to send it to all your friends and acquaintances and so forth. I'm your host, Bill Dixon, Vietnam vet 6768. We're broadcasting from the international headquarters here of the Nissan Communications. So again, thank Amnon Nissan and Nissan Communications for all the hard work he does keeping me in line doing this show and so forth. Now, what we want you to do is take part in the show. We want you to come on the show at 919-518-9773, or even better than that, come on to Computers Take 2K Voice. That's 2 capital K Voice, and take part of the show. And if you need to get in touch with me, Lessons of Vietnam at ncvi.org and so forth. Also, I put down a caveat for future shows and so forth. Any comments or opinions by myself or any guests that are on the show do not reflect any organization whatsoever. There is so much misinformation and myths about the Vietnam War that I recommend that anything you hear me say or any guest here on the show that you look up and do some research of your own. I go through and I reference a lot of books. When I'm doing the show, I found out doing this show that anybody can write a book and get it published. It ain't always the truth, but I try to, the best I can, to give you the truth, the best I can possibly do. Everybody deserves the facts, but not their own facts. So I try to give you the truth as much as I can. Tonight's show is a compilation of several different subjects and so forth. The subject of tonight's show is Vietnam stories, strange but true. What we're going to talk about the first tonight is the Tomb of an Unknown Soldier. It's located in Arlington National Cemetery. Just to kind of throw you out something, I just saw recently that in the changing of the guards, the sergeant of the guard slipped and dropped the rifle, and the bayonet stuck the guard in the foot. And that guard, knowing that he had a job to do, as they do, it's unbelievable, the weather and so forth, he continued doing his guard duty until they started noticing he was leaving bloody footprints. But these guys are committed and have to go through a whole lot. Now, with the Tomb of an Unknown, which is what the soldier does, although the remains of the tomb are of unknown individuals, the Tomb of an Unknown Soldier is a symbol of all known soldiers and their remains. The sarcophagus, you'll have to pronounce that the way you want to. Atop the tomb of the first soldier buried at the site features 3 Greek soldiers that represent peace, valor, and victory. The inscription on the tomb reads, "Here rest in honor and glory a soldier known but to God." Currently, by the way, there is no remains in the Tomb of an Unknown Soldier. That's one of the things we're going to be talking about tonight. There were remains there at one time. They are no longer there. Next one. The Tomb of an Unknown Soldier is guarded 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, by the 3rd U.S. Infantry Regiment. And from October through March, the guards change every hour. From April through September, the guards change every 30 minutes, and it's quite a show. If you've never been there to see the change in the guards, if you're anywhere around Washington, D.C., Arlington National Cemetery, you owe it to yourself and your family to go. The dedication of these troops to guard this special, honored, sacred site is just unbelievable. The Vietnam soldiers' remains were disinterred in 1998 after the body was identified using DNA. There should never be another unknown soldier in the tomb of an unknown soldier as far as remains. Because with DNA as it is today, they should always be able to, in some way, identify. After they disinterred the remains, it was decided that the tomb would remain empty to pay honor to all Americans missing and servicemen from 1958 to 1975. The Vietnam War remains had been in the tomb of the unknown soldier at Arlington National Cemetery since the Memorial Day services in 1984. For 14 years, those remains were kept in the tomb until they were disinterred. On the day that those remains were put in the tomb of an unknown soldier, President Ronald Reagan presided over a ceremony, and during that time, he awarded now this is where some of the controversy comes in, he rewarded the tomb of an unknown soldier, or he rewarded the remains of the tomb of unknowns of the soldier who was going in the remains, who lost his life in Southeast Asia during the war. And those were the remains that had been selected to go into the tomb of the unknown. Now, there was a POW advocate from Kinston, North Carolina, by the name of Ted Sampley. Ted did as much work on the POW MIA movement as anybody in the country. I was at Ted Sampley's house when some of the national magazines would contact Ted to ask information and so forth. Some people call him the Kinston Crazy. There's a lot of government groups out there who hated him, called him, and thought he was crazy and so forth because of what he did. Ted knew about the POW MIA situation. He did extensive work on the situation with the remains of the unknown soldier. His research showed there was a high probability that these remains were those of Lieutenant Michael J. Blassie. Ted, before publishing his findings in the USA Veteran, which was US Veteran, which was a magazine that he published, he called Lieutenant Blassie's mother before publishing it, and soon after he published it, he took a copy of the article to the Pentagon. Now, Lieutenant Blassie's sister saw the article and called the Air Force, as anybody in the family would be. The Air Force told her there was nothing to substantiate Sampley's claim. The Pentagon assured the family that Sampley was wrong. 2 years later, Sampley reprinted that article and put it online. And since it was online, a CBS producer picked up the story and contacted Sampley and requested information on the claim. Now, Sampley put all the information he had and faxed it to the producer. These producers spent the next 8 months investigating the claim and Ted Sampley. Not only did CBS, by the way, that's a picture of Ted Sampley. There, if you've ever gone up to see the wall, right across from the Lincoln Memorial, there's kind of a shack there that Ted started many years ago. Before his death, he gave it to Rolling Thunder as a fundraiser and so forth. But going back to what we found out was not only did the CBS conclude that remains were Lieutenant Blassie's, but the Pentagon had known all along whose remains were. They uncovered 2 forensic technicians at the Army lab in Hawaii. Hawaii is where the vast majority of DNA and so forth is checked for remains from all the different wars. They told CBS that not only were the remains of those of Lieutenant Blassie, but their bosses had known all along, along with some military officials. They protested the fact that they were going to unidentify the remains, but they were told to do what you were told, and that's the way it is. But along the lines, after CBS did this expose, they never mentioned the fact that Ted Sample came up with the real thing. They were ordered, these technicians were ordered at the time to replace the remains. There was a flight suit recovered, there was a wallet, and some other things that were recovered along with the remains, and they were told to put all of that in the casket, make sure that there was no record whatsoever of Lieutenant Blassie. And this is a picture of Lieutenant Michael J. Blassie. His remains represented the Vietnam War. His A-37 plane was shot down on May 11, 1972 in the Vietnam War. With CBS coming out with their article, expose, Ted Sample with his article and so forth, Michael J. Blassie's family crusaded, got out there and going, wait a minute now, CBS, who's supposed to be very reputable back then, said that they knew who the remains were. And so finally they exhumed the remains, did a DNA test and so forth, and identified these remains of those of Michael J. Blassie.
I have a question.
Uh-huh.
Why was it covered up? Why, I mean, what's the purpose of saying, no, that's not him?
Well, you almost have to be in the military.
Okay.
The colonel comes along and says, I want this done. Well, the major don't care how you get it done as long as you get it done. They were going to have a ceremony, and the President of the United States was going to come and preside over that ceremony. They needed some remains. They didn't care whose remains they were. They needed a set of remains for the presentation. So whoever the powers would be says, we're going to use these remains. The technician says, we know who they are. But the powers that be says, we don't care who they are. We need a set of remains because the president's coming.
And that's for the tomb of the unknown
soldier. For the ceremony.
So you can't put something that you know who it is. So it's supposed to be unknown.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, that's what the whole thing was. They put them there even though they knew they were. It's just like we built a bridge in Vietnam. It was the largest built engineered bridge on spot. The general's coming. The bridge is eye-shaped. And on each part of the eye, there's supposed to be a metal plate plated so that the eye doesn't wobble.
Mm-hmm.
They didn't have time to do that because the general's coming. And they wanted a show for the general. So what they did was they had opening ceremonies for the general. And it looked good. The bridge looked beautiful. But after the general left, nobody went back and put the metal support plates in. So the first time a tank convoy went across the bridge, it looked like a snake weaving back and forwards until they stopped and went back and put in but they had to get it done for the general for the ceremony because the general couldn't be held up for his ceremony, but they just never went back and did it. This was kind of the way these remains were handled. Okay. We got them in there now. We won't tell anybody that we know who they are. It is felt by some of that the government officials needed a set of remains, which we just talked about, for the 1984 Memorial Day ceremony. So they selected remains they had on hand. Just happened to be a set of remains hanging around. Since his wallet and dog tags had been found along with the crash site, they wanted to make sure they hid those so that would be fairly, there wasn't much chance of them getting, nobody would never know. You know, they were covering up. So they put all that stuff into in the casket with him so there would be no detection. After they removed Michael's remains, they were buried in the Jefferson Barracks National Cemetery near his home on July 11th, 1998. But now we come up with a new dilemma. Not like the Blassie family had not already gone through much more than any family should. The United States Department of Defense stripped the Medal of Honor from Michael J. Blassie, which brings us up to question. Did they give the Medal of Honor to Michael J. Blassie, the unknown soldier, or did they give the Medal of Honor to the Vietnam War unknown who just happened to be known, which brought out a lot of new controversy. See, on Memorial Day of 1984, when President Reagan presided over the ceremony for the Vietnam War unknown, we're going to keep right on using that word unknown, he also awarded the Medal of Honor to those remains. Now, usually the Medal of Honor is awarded only after the recipient has been nominated by his commander for heroic deeds. Once someone is put in for the Medal of Honor, there's a great deal of background check. Since the unknowns, we don't know whether they did a heroic deed or not other than getting killed. So in order to make it legal, Congress legalized the Medal of Honor to an unknown soldier whose deeds in battle were unknown. Congress created and passed a special law authorizing the president to make that presentation, just for the fact that he was unknown. The Blassie family asked for the Medal of Honor to remain with Lieutenant Blassie. They felt that the Medal of Honor was presented to Lieutenant Blassie while he was serving as the unknown soldier of Vietnam, and because he was awarded the Medal of Honor for that service and should not be stripped from him. With the Pentagon knowing at the time of the interment of the remains that they were in fact those of Lieutenant Michael Blassie, with the fact that the Pentagon went out of its way to keep that knowledge from the Blassie family, was the Medal of Honor actually awarded to Lieutenant Blassie? Well, you decide. Most of the veterans organizations came up and said, no, you would desecrate the tomb and owned soldier if you gave Lieutenant Blassie the Medal of Honor, because he's not unknown. But the Pentagon had already dishonored the tomb of the unknown by putting known remains in the tomb, leaving the family in limbo as to the status of the loved one. Is the Medal of Honor awarded to the remains of someone lost in the Vietnam War, or the tomb and remembrance of someone representative of the Vietnam War? I'm going to let you decide which way it should have gone. Do you think Lieutenant Blassie and his family should have kept the Medal of Honor? Do you think it just goes to the tomb or the purported remains, which will no longer be there supposedly, because there should never be another unknown? You decide. Let me know how you decide. Okay, we're going to completely jump all to a totally different subject now. If you've never been in the United States military, you probably never heard the word sheep dipped. Well, this was, these people we're going to be talking about very shortly got sheep dipped. The reason they were sheep dipped, because they were assigned to a top secret site, Lima Site 85. In fact, up until not too many years ago, was that whole site unclassified. Now, how do we come about that site? In the latter half of 1966, the idea was conceived to install a radar bombing control system at Tay Can Channel 97, which was Site 85 in Laos. Now, you remember, Laos was not in the war. They were, quote, neutral, which was a joke. The sophisticated piece of electronic equipment was to direct airstrikes without the pilot actually being able to see his target. The idea was they would fly so high they couldn't see the target, but the target could be painted by these radar. The advantage being, as I just said, one, that the aircraft can fly at an altitude reachable only by surface-to-air missiles or SAMs. Bombings could be accomplished at all weather day or night. In other words, if the weather was bad between the ground and the bomber, they didn't have to worry about it because they didn't need to see the site anyway. So that would have been great advantages to have something like that in the bombing of Hanoi and so forth. The advantages were obvious, but there was a political obstacle. We were going into a neutral country to build this site in this neutral company. Placing this equipment in northern Laos would imply that Laos was allowing another country to use their country to mount an attack on a neighbor. And they were a neighbor country, and of course they were neutral, so they couldn't exactly do that. But North Vietnam was using their soil to transport men down the Ho Chi Minh Trail and so forth. And I know you've heard of the Ho Chi Minh Trail. Now, the location, basically, the Laotian government, my tongue's not working here, the Laotian government finally come back and said, okay, you can locate it there, but don't tell us that you did that. You don't tell us that we do it. That way we legitimately can say we don't know anything about it, which is kind of goes back to what we're going to be talking about in a minute, as being sheep dipped. This site was 120 miles from Hanoi, which is basically, and it was also about 15 miles from the North Vietnamese border. This kind of give you an idea in perspective where it was. The next picture is this site. Not a whole lot to it. Lima Site 85. The trailer with the open door housed the communications equipment. Trailer to the left was the TSQ-81 with radar dish camouflaged. To the left were electrical generators and frequency converters. The living quarters is shown in the foreground. That's where and a dumpster, yeah. Well, the whole place was basically a dumpster, yeah. Okay. At any one time, there were 15 plus or minus American stations at the site. Just like the other Tekon sites all throughout Laos that didn't exist. Now, these individuals are all U.S. Air Force personnel formerly converted to civilian status as Lockheed employees. They were sheep dipped. So what they did was, these guys were all in the Air Force, but we couldn't have anybody in the Air Force located in Laos because we weren't there. So what we asked these guys to do was to resign from the Air Force, go to work for Lockheed as civilians. That way, if they were ever found out, they could always say, well, there's no military presence there. They're all civilians. Well, part of the problem was that there was not a whole lot of protection from these guys once they did that, because they're no longer protected under the Geneva Convention, which was a joke anyway, because none of the communists ever went by it. So they were in shadow cover, as we will say. Like I said, they'd leave the Air Force. If they were captured or killed, their families would be covered by either company insurance or the Air Force insurance. They were called the Heavy Green Team. That was their code name. They were all deployed to, I think altogether was like 45 of them who were specially selected by the Air Force, who resigned from the Air Force. They actually brought all the wives in but one. She was born in Russia, so she couldn't get security clearance, so they never told her what was going on. But the wives came in and sworn to secrecy that their husbands were getting out of the Air Force and were going to work for Lockheed at this special site. So they were deployed to the Udorn Royal Thai Air Base in northern Thailand, and they set up shop there in quonset huts in Air America. Well, since they were even in the Air America compound, that pretty much said that they were spooks, spies. The ship, excuse me, let me go back over that word again. I know I can say that. The sheep-dipped airmen lived in rental housing off the base. But at the base, they wore Air Force uniforms, and they carried military ID. But when they were under their cover roll and they were going to Lima Site 85, they had to change back into civilian clothes. They were pretending to be Air Force personnel at Udorn, even though they were not Air Force personnel. They were Lockheed personnel, but who were pretending to be Air Force people. Let me make sure you understand. These were Air Force people who were pretending to be Lockheed employees, who, when they were at Udorn, pretending to be Air Force people. But when they went out to the site for their 2-week rotation, they came back to be Lockheed employees. Now, that's as clear as mud, okay? Lima Site 85, who was top secret, almost nobody in the military even knew about it, and their Air Force radar facility set atop one of the highest mountains in Laos, 15 miles away from the border with North Vietnam. Now, why did they locate them there? For several reasons, 15 miles from the North Vietnamese border. But the site was defended by 1,000 Hmong irregulars. The Hmong were the Pathat Lao troops that were basically recruited to fight for the Americans and so forth. Not a whole lot has heard about them, but these guys were fantastic fighters, and they gave everything they had. Long after the Americans left, they kept right on going. So in the valley below the mountain, we had 1,000 Hmong irregulars. But the mountain itself was the chief part of the security. See, it dropped off on 3 sides to a sheer cliff. And it was felt that nobody would ever be able to climb that sheer cliff. I guess none of them had ever seen the Marines climbing Mount Suribachi during the Iwo Jima battles when they were going to Japan. We'll go into that in a little bit. So, and then there was a mountain itself, and the mountain was fortified. In early 1968, the North Vietnamese troops began building a road through the thick Laotian jungle, which was pointed straight at Site 85. But lo and behold, nobody seemed to get the idea that road was going somewhere. So while the CIA and the Air Force were arguing over the intent of the road, it just kept right on coming and coming. The Air Force made let's go bomb the road. We got nothing else to do today situation. So they bombed the road a few times. It was fixed. They hauled off the debris and went right back to building the road. Keep right on coming. Keep right on coming. Finally, on the 10th and 11th of March of 1968, the communists got around to attacking. The communists didn't want to use their really good airplanes, so what they did was make small airplanes like our Cessnas. They were flying over, and the guys in the airplanes were taking handmade bombs and dropping them out of their airplane on the site. Basically, that was a cover-up, a ruse, because while they were doing that, remember that cliff that nobody could climb? Well, it seems that the North Vietnamese sappers were climbing that cliff. And they climbed the cliff, and the mortar rounds started coming in, and the attacks coming home. And when all was said and done, of the 19 Americans that were there, 16 of them were part of the Lockheed group. The other 3 kind of gives you the idea that maybe they had CIA after their name. They were basically overrun. Of the 16 that were there, like I said, and later to make sure that the enemy did not get any information from the Lima site, we bombed it. So first of all, the North Vietnamese bombed it and attacked it, and then when they were through with it, we went in and bombed it. They really got sheep-dipped. This is some of the people who were there. The Americans now this is the name of the mountain. I'm going to skip trying to even come close to naming the mountain. We're just going to call it Lima Site 85. On March 11th, 1968, rescued Captain Stanley J. Slitz, rescued Staff Sergeant John Daniel, rescued Staff Sergeant Bill Husband, rescued Staff Sergeant Jack Starling, rescued Sergeant Roger Huffman, rescued Howard Freeman, CIA, John Spencer, CIA. See, the powers that be knew they could get there and rescue all their people if something was to happen. But nobody ever thought about the fact that this was monsoon season and the weather was bad. Killed during the rescue was Command Sergeant Major Richard L. Eckenberg. He was actually got on the helicopter, but small arms fire was coming into the helicopter and he was shot laying on the floor of the helicopter and killed. Now, killed in action during this battle, body not recovered, Lieutenant Colonel Clarence F. Blanton, Master Sergeant James H. Calfrey, Technical Sergeant Melvin A. Holland, and as you see, I have him highlighted in red. There's a reason for that, which we'll get into. Staff Sergeant Herbert A. Kirk, Staff Sergeant Henry G. Gish, Staff Sergeant Springdesh, and Sergeant Don F. Worley. Now, they're calling them sergeants here, but they aren't sergeants because they're working for Lockheed. But they were sergeants because they were, well, anyway. And killed in action during the battle that they did recover his body was Tech Sergeant Patrick L. Shannon. Now, this was the single largest ground combat loss by the United States Air Force in the Vietnam War. See, even the statisticians who said that this is the largest Air Force can't make up their mind whether they're Air Force employees, Air Force personnel or Lockheedian personnel. Their names were even kept off the POW MIA list until 1982. The Pentagon even admitted then, when they put it on, when they come out with it, they had never looked for survivors since the attack. They had never gone back to look for these men who were missing whatsoever before they went back and bombed to keep the communists from getting information from the Lima Site. They never went back and looked to see these men. Kind of goes back to make you think of Joseph Hargrove and Danny Marshall and the other Marine whose name escaped me, they're at the island of Kongtang, being left on the island. But as we mentioned a while ago, I highlighted him because his story continues. One of those Americans on Lima Site 85 was Air Force technician, was Sergeant Melvin Arnold Holland. His wife found out about this situation in 1982 that they had never looked, never mentioned anything about him and so forth. And you remember the wife who was born in Russia and they wouldn't tell her anything? That's where she found out a lot about what happened to her husband at that time also. Well, Ms. Holland was, to say the least, she was ticked off, infuriated with what she found. She sued the military for these records. This is Tech Sergeant Melvin Arnold Holland. He is on the wall like the others missing, panel 44 East, line 21. At least they did get that much recognition from the government. When she got the copy of the documents contain a report that captured Pathat Lao, Laotian communist, platoon leader, reported seeing a white male wearing glasses with light-colored frames, being brought to a Laotian communist headquarters soon after the battle. But that Lao escorted the prisoner, stated to him he was an American they had captured from around the site of 85. Mel Holland was the only man on the mountain that fit that description. These documents they found were also consistent with at least 3 other sets of documents or reports that Americans had been captured in the battle, and the communist area where the men believed to be held, or Holland was held, was included communist POW camps located in Laos. No American POWs have ever come out of Laos, with the exception of one we're going to be talking about in just a minute. Even after the prisoners of war were brought home, the American prisoners were brought home, there was a group of soldiers, Vietnamese soldiers, who were captured in Laos, who were not going to be released because there was no record of them. But General Norman Gaddis, who has been on this show, said, wait a minute, they were prisoners of war and they need to be let go also. So we come up to the question of this. And again, this is a question for you to answer. Was Melvin Holland killed at Lima 58? 85, yes. I thought I went back and changed that. I saw it earlier and went back and changed that. You caught me in a mistake. Listen, you get no prize for that, but other than the fact that you found me in a mistake. Okay? Okay, keep going. Or was he left to die in a Laotian POW camp? They don't know because they left him. Some records have been also indicated that some of the American POWs were sent to Russia, which is a whole new story and another show we'll get into a little bit later, another day, as we will say. Now, let's talk about the longest held American civilian during the Vietnam War. He was captured in Laos. And because he was such a pain in the rear end, direct area to the Laotian communist, they actually took him to Hanoi Hilton just to get rid of him. Now, how did he become about to being the longest held American civilian in Vietnam War is a story in itself. See, here is Admiral Noel Gaylor welcoming Ernest Brace on his arrival in Tokyo from Hanoi after being released with the other POWs. Now, how did he get there? Ernest C. Brace was a Marine Corps pilot who was decorated. Remember, I said he was civilian. Hold your horses. We'll get there. Ernest C. Brace was a Marine Corps pilot who was decorated for combat service in his career. Then he was court-martialed for desertion after a stateside plane crash and was later celebrated for his fortitude as the longest-held civilian POW in Vietnam. He spent nearly 8 years in captivity. And if you don't do anything else, get his book and read it. It's called Code to Keep. I'm going to show it to you in just a minute. By his early 20s, Mr. Brace was seasoned and accomplished pilot. He flew more than 100 missions in career, including one in which he encountered heavy enemy fire and was forced to crash land in the Sea of Japan when he was rescued. Oh, wouldn't have this story. For these actions, Mr. Brace received the Distinguished Flying Cross. In January 1961, he was a captain enrolled in an officer's training course in Quantico, Virginia, right outside of D.C., and he was flying a plane, and it crashed at the Maryland's eastern shore, but it disappeared. Mr. Brace abandoned the scene, reportedly hitchhiked to Baltimore, and turned himself in 10 days later after they found his flight suit. Now, to be perfectly honest with you, I don't know why anybody would hitchhike to Baltimore. Maybe that's got something to do with why he turned himself in. He said at the time that he was burdened by domestic and financial problems and had hoped to get away from it all. I guess he thought they would declare him dead, but they left the suit laying around. Law enforcement officials alleged that he had attempted to fake his own death in order to allow his family to collect on life insurance policy. During his trial, Mr. Brace insisted that the plane had malfunctioned, and the federal jury acquitted him of that and from that and let him go on that point. But the Marine Corps came along and said, okay, former captain of the Marine Corps, you deserted. So we're going to punish you, and they kicked him out of the service. So the man who loved the Marine Corps and was a good soldier, except for the fact he had some personal problems, was kicked out of the Marines. He kind of kicked around for a while, and later he became a civilian contract pilot, ferrying supplies and passengers to Laos during the Vietnam War. I think we call that something to do with the CIA. On May 21st, 1965, Communist forces attacked his plane on a Laotian airstrip. He had landed to unload, and there were some other things going on. He was captured and taken to a jungle prison where he began his 7 years, 10 months, and 1 week in enemy hands. Now, being as he was a former Marine and he was captured, he was not exactly easy to get along with for the communists. During that period, he recalled an account published on the POW network site, which would be spent mostly encaged in small bamboo cage. He was beaten, he was starved, buried alive. I mean, they buried him up to his neck, humiliated him as few modern day humans are known. They buried him alive for a week or so. When he got through, they dug him out. He couldn't even walk. He was in such bad shape. They treated the man, I mean, they did just unbelievable things to the man as far as food and torture and so forth. Part of the problem was he continued trying to escape. He'd come up with all kinds of ways to escape. He was in a one-man cage, tiger cage, and he actually had a guard standing there watching him supposedly not escape. But even he would still try to escape, and quite often did escape with a guard standing there, which means the guard ended up beating him as well as the other people and so forth. He even tried to hang himself from his cage at one time. Eventually, his health was so bad, and he had given him such a hard time, he was transferred to Hanoi complex in North Vietnam, who most of y'all have heard as the word Hanoi Hilton. There he was able to learn the tap system, the furtive message transmitting between cells. They were not allowed to communicate, even though they were, with the communists there, they were to be able to have the tap system, which I think Bill Schuette and Norman Gaddis, who were both POWs who have been on earlier shows, explain how the tap system works. We won't go into it. If you'd like to know how the tap system worked, go back to see some of their former shows. Next to him in the cell was a guy by the name of John McCain. John McCain was, father was an admiral. He was shot down and crash landed in the lake there in Hanoi. They actually have him there as they got a plaque there going, we shot John McCain down here, except they spelled his name wrong. On March 28, 1973, along with the other prisoners of war, he was released. And soon time after that, Richard Nixon had a dinner for all the POWs, and at that time he really got to meet John McCain for the first time. Now, I've thrown a lot of questions and so forth out there. I'm going to throw this out to you. I'd like for you to call 919-518-9773 or Computers 2K Voice and take part. Give me some answers. What do you think about some of the questions I've asked? Moving right along, in 1974, President Gerald Ford granted Mr. Brace a full pardon. That was his full pardon from being kicked out of the Marine Corps. That was from an efforts of John McCain. So he was able to receive the Purple Heart and the Prisoner of War Medal because with the pardon, he was back in being an official Marine. As a civilian, Ernie was under no obligation to adhere to the code of conduct, McCain wrote in his memoir, Faith of My Fathers, but his conscience demanded much from him. He followed the chain of command that the other officers and so forth. He kept the secrets. They offered to release him before some of the others, but as the other military officers were saying, we don't go home until everybody goes home. So John McCain says that no one he knew in prison, Army, Navy, Marine, or Air Force officer had a greater loyalty to his country or derived more courage from his sense of honor. So he was offered all these things to make life a little easier for him. He turned them down. Now, I mentioned his book, A Code to Keep. If you get a chance, it's a great read. It's a great story. I encourage you to any of the stuff that I tell you or any guest, as I mentioned a while ago, does on this show, check it out. This is his story by him. He was a former Marine hero, banished and disgraced from the Marine Corps. Yet, while he was captured, he kept and maintained the military code of conduct, even though he didn't really have to. Listen to what they did to this man and how he hung in there. Now, I'm going to talk to you about some very controversial subjects now. I'm going to suggest that you get this book, The Phoenix Program by Douglas Valentine. Thanks to the works of Douglas Valentine and his classic book, The Phoenix Program, we have an extremely detailed account of the Phoenix Program, exposing a classical example of the brutality of the CIA's counterinsurgency wars. All wars are brutal, and if you read this, I'm not putting what the CIA did down because you do a lot of things during the war period. By studying the Phoenix Program, one can gain a great deal of insight into wars in Afghanistan, Syria, and Iraq today. What was the Phoenix Program? From the perspective of a bureaucrat like Bill Colby, who was director of the CIA, who was later assassinated, which may have something to do with this Phoenix Program, it was merely an attempt to coordinate a number of pre-existing programs, sort of like the Department of Homeland Security, or more precisely, its fusion centers where military, police, and intelligence agencies pool information for enemies to the American people. In other words, it was supposed to be a gathering site for all different covert operations. Phoenix sought to provide cooperation between the various Vietnamese and American agencies so they can cooperate and coordinate their war on the Vietnamese people. What was the Phoenix Program? A massive campaign of torture, assassination aimed at destroying what the CIA called the VCI, the Viet Cong infrastructure. This was the forerunner of the Phoenix Program. As you can see, that's a handmade patch. It was probably some special forces guy had Mama Son to make it for him. It was the ICX, which was the CIA operational pacification program run mostly by the special forces. The operation ran from as early as 1961 It was organized and operated by CIA operatives out of Saigon Station in conjunction with South Vietnamese intelligence operatives and indigenous, you can say it the way you want to, mercenaries. In other words, that's people who live there. Only officially named in 1967. Up until the night, for 6 years, they didn't even exist as a program. ICX was actually operating from as early as 1960, run by the CIA. Later, the Phoenix program, Operation Phoenix Assassination Program. And they were borrowed most of the ideas from the unit as Phoenix was coming along. They borrowed most of the ideas from the ICX. In many cases, post-1966, ICX operated in conjunction with the Phoenix program, although it remained as a separate unit, run by the CIA entity that sat with MACV-SOG. Now, that was the Special Forces. You see people all the time who tell you they were with MACV-SOG. They would tell you what they did. They'd have to kill you and their information doesn't show up on their 201 file because it was so top secret. The ICX program was considerably more aggressive than the Phoenix program, which was hard to believe because they were pretty well out there. Okay, I'm gonna have to go through fast because I got a lot I want to get over with and so forth. Interestingly, the Phoenix program had its roots in an attempt to mimic the tactics of the Viet Cong, the terrorism tactics, the scare people to death tactics. Vietnam was quite literally a giant laboratory to study counterinsurgency tactics. We had never had quite a situation there. In the early days of the CIA presence, there were various CIA province chiefs, the Vietnamese who were head of their, it's kind of like being a county, were allowed to experiment with different ways to combat the growing revolution. Ralph Johnson decided to create the Mountain Scouts to initiate the tactics of armed propaganda teams, recruiting hardened criminals, Viet Cong defectors, and various ethnic minorities like the Hmong and the Montagnards. The CIA formed brutal death squads, highly trained in methods of covert war. Okay. They would sneak into a village at night and brutally slaughter. Now, I'm using the words that were here. Brutally slaughter someone they suspected at working with the NFL, National Liberation Front, which were the communists. I'm going to keep the word brutally slaughter there, but y'all have to remember, these people brutally slaughtered the people in the villages. Okay? And they went into, and then they would blame the attack on the Viet Cong on themselves. They called the tactical counter-terror, ironically, since they were doing was terrorism themselves, but they were going into counter-terror, which they basically did because the Viet Cong were terrorizing the village and so forth. However, the primary purpose of the death squad commandos was to sneak into NFL-controlled territory and kidnap and control some targets. The idea was to keep both North and South Vietnamese kind of scared and so forth. Okay. The provincial reconnaissance units, or as the CIA's Vietnamese death squads were renamed, were the most effective fighting units in South Vietnam because they would sneak in at night, they would eliminate the communists and sneak back out, and people in the village wouldn't even know they were necessarily there. They would form one of the primary elements of the Phoenix program. Along with the field police, they would be the enforcers of the government law. The next element of the Phoenix program was the province interrogative centers of the PICs. Ooh, that's easy for y'all to say. Basically, these went in and got the information. Using the CIA format, Company Pacific Architect and Engineers. I never knew they were CIA built, and they were everywhere. They built prisons all over the country, and they used them to torture political prisoners. Vietnam was covered by these villages, all little sites all across Vietnam and so forth. At first, the Viet Cong would go in and try to free their prisoners and so forth. So they went back in and fixed these little huts and so forth, much more secure. All kinds of things went on inside. The third aspect of the Phoenix program was intelligence collection. The CIA maintained a network of spies throughout the country, and it was attempted to assemble a master list of all NFL members in South Vietnam. They set up an ICX in an attempt to coordinate intelligence from the CIA, the Vietnamese Special Branch, which ran the high-level NFL infiltrators, the field police, the PRU, and the U.S. military intelligence. However, in reality, it didn't work all that well. You see, the problem was the South Vietnamese people were always plotting against themselves. If you were a Providence chief, you did not want the other Providence chief to know the secrets that you had, because he might tell somebody about them, and then the president of South Vietnam would go, well, look what he did, and look what he knew, and why didn't you know that? So they kept everything secret because it would look better for them to know the stuff rather than their counterparts down the road. And it was kind of like, let's save face, as we talked about with the Vietnamese. So that was one of the problems with getting information and so forth through the South Vietnamese units and so forth, was because once the news got to the Providence chief, he didn't necessarily want to share it because it might put his buddy down the road up a little bit. It wasn't so much they were interested in winning the war or fighting for their country. It was let's make us look better than our buddy down the road. Okay. The Phoenix program was thus a massive program to capture and kill the VCI with the captured Vietnamese communist infrastructure, with the captured being tortured to reveal more names. It is also a massive psychological operation, psychological operations aimed at the mind of the enemy. They can range from propaganda to terrorism, and both were prominent features of the program. And one of the things we're going to talk about next was, well, before we do that, this is something I come up with today. This was a RAND study, which was a think tank. And after all those things I said about the Phoenix program, I actually met the guy who ran the Phoenix program several years back. I want to read you this. According to the RAND study, the Phoenix program has been mischaracterized as an assassination program. It was not. Phoenix was an intelligence operation that aimed to lift the shrouds of the invisible Viet Cong empire that operated in rural villages and hamlets. Phoenix did have an action arm made up of mostly South Vietnamese along with U.S. advisors that targeted subterranean high-value targets. The communist cadre who collected taxes, gathered information, and spread propaganda and recruited new members. Although sometimes unavoidable, killing Viet Cong suspects was not the program's intent. According to an American advisor quoted by RAND, capturing and interrogating suspected insurgents was the aim so that the shadow government could be unmasked. Prisoner snatch were the key. You can't get information out of a dead man. That kind of throws you into basically what I said was, but the book talks about how mean they were, and the RAND Corporation says this is what they did, which is what the book said, but they weren't all that bad guys. So I'll let you read and do your own research. Now, part of the program we've talked about as far as the propaganda program, this was the Chu Hoi program, the Open Arms program. And if you look at the middle of the two pictures there, it says Safe Conduct leaflet. The United States government and South Vietnamese government put these things out all over Vietnam. And the idea was, if you stand up and you're in a firefight and you stand up and hold this leaflet up and say, Chu Hoi, the American or the South Vietnamese was supposed to stop shooting at you. I tell you what, I might hold up that leaflet, but I wouldn't stand up and go and Chu Hoi until they quit shooting, because there was a good chance you got killed and so forth. But the idea was to hold up the program. Defections were encouraged by means of a propaganda and campaign, usually leaflets delivered by artillery shell or dropped over enemy-controlled areas by aircraft, or messages broadcast over areas of South Vietnam. A number of incentives were offered to those who chose to cooperate. Got a house, they got a suit, they got some money, all kinds of things. The Chu Ho program was considered very successful. Those who surrendered were known as Hoa Chons, and they were often integrated into allied units such as Kit Carson Scouts. Quite often you would see former Viet Cong going out with American units. They were acting as scouts, just like the American scout Kit Carson did. Again, we had to be real careful with the, and I didn't know it until recently, but the Vietnamese, the communists, had their open arms program. Little known episode of the Vietnam War is the attempts by the Viet Cong to convince American soldiers to come over to their side by offering them money and women. And it says there, hey American, this girl and $10,000 cash. You do not need to fight your own people. You just need we just need your cooperation and learning your training. In other words, they were saying, if you come over, we won't make you fight against the Americans. We just want you to tell us how you train. You can just earn a little extra cash if you choose to assist in our training or intelligence program. Live in comfort and safety in Europe or Asia. In other words, after it was over with, they were going to send you to Europe or Asia. Now, if you were an advisor, an American advisor, special forces and so forth, most of those guys had, and Cap Marines, they had bounties on their head. So here we are reaching out to them. Advisors, there's a reward for your capture or death. This girl and $10,000. Surrender now and live. We will pay for information on your training. The basic message of these leaflets is, hey Americans, this girl and $10,000 in cash living in comfort in Europe or Asia. You don't have to fight your own people. We need you to cooperate with you. We want to cooperate with you and help you and let you show us how you train. You can get some extra money if you were to help us train or participate in our intelligence program. Now, I don't know whether any Americans ever, we're going to skip that for the next show. I don't know whether any Americans ever did this or not. I'm certain that there were Americans who were living in Saigon who deserted and so forth. I never heard of Americans doing this, but I did hear of soldiers out who would think they saw, after a firefight, who thought they saw an American involved and so forth. So that's tonight's show. A lot of strange information about the Vietnam War put out there. The Vietnam War is misunderstood, and it's a strange story in itself. But thank you for tuning in. Be sure and tell all your friends about us. We look forward to having you tune in again. Oh, by the way, today was Flag Day. I hope you flew your flag like you're supposed to on Flag Day. The last show told you how to fly it and how to take care of it and so forth. So again, we will see you on our next show, which would be June 28th. So looking forward to seeing you then. Tell all your friends about us, and we'll see you June 28th.
You are tuned to the Nissan Communications Network. If you tuned in too late, you can always watch each program in its entirety or download an MP3 audio file of it in the archives section at nissancommunications.com. Don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel, follow us on Twitter, and like us on Facebook. Sponsored by Telestream's Wirecast software, StreamingGear.com, Carolina Apparel, and DeltaForce.net.